Steph, who's on the call, wrote the literal book on how to do content online. As we just talked about, a few folks have already read it. I've certainly read it and have just been blown away at the depth and thoroughness of what she's written. And she's learned this kind of over the past few years, actually like doing work like this. She has a personal blog that got a ton of attention and subscribers in its first year. She's managed some kind of like technical blogs with hundreds of thousands of subscribers and millions of readers. And I think everyone on the call is familiar with The Hustle, where she runs Trends, which is like their paid subscription business, which is actually a huge business and is just, to me, the pinnacle of a lot of what's possible online with creating great content. And what we're going to do on this call, we can't talk about everything in the book because it is really a dense book, but I think we'll focus on the first half, which is thinking about your personal monopoly is the expression now, but thinking about how to really nail a niche or a specific vertical where there's going to be a lot of growth potential, how to write high quality content and how to differentiate yourself as a writer. And then finally, how to actually think about distribution, like in a strategic, thoughtful way. Because I think that's probably the thing that gets overlooked the most as a writer. But first of all, Steph, thank you for joining us. Have I missed anything in your amazing background?
No, you got it.
Amazing. I guess, Steph, maybe I'll start with this first question. Does the world really need another blog and another writer sharing their ideas online?
It's a good question. And it's something that I struggled with before I started my own blog. I spent years debating launching one and never did because I was like, really, does the world need another person who needs to write about XYZ that already exists online? I've reframed my view there. And I think before even getting into whether the world needs another blog, it's important to understand like why there's so much content online these days. And it's not just because all of a sudden everyone woke up one day and was like, I want to create content and put it online. Everyone, or for a long time, I think people have had the yearning to put their ideas online because that's really what any form of writing online is. It's an opinion about what's important. But before, it was incredibly hard. Before the internet, you didn't have the ability to put content online easily. Tools have made that incredibly easy now, but also you didn't have the ability to target and distribute effectively in the past. If you think back to before the age of the internet, if you wanted to reach anyone, it would be through large mediums like a newspaper or a radio station, which were not targeted at all. It'd be to like the city of Toronto or the city of Dallas. And so you didn't have the ability to write about niche topics as easily because you couldn't get them to the right people. So now the internet has changed, how easy it is to put content online because anyone with an internet connection can now do, but also the ability to reach the people that you want to reach through the internet and also like with the scope of the entire world. So that's really compelling. Right now, everyone can do this. And a lot of people are doing this for this reason because it's so easy to put it there. It's not necessarily easy to succeed, but it's easy to get your stuff online. But because the barrier to entry has decreased, the supply of content has increased, but the supply of great content has not increased proportionally to the supply of overall content, right? Because when the barrier to entry lowers, people just put content online because they can, not necessarily because they're thinking deeply about the topic or because they really feel like they have an edge or a differentiator with the things that they're talking about. They're just putting content online because they want to effectively. And that's something really key to understand. But with that said, if you fall into that bucket or you just want to put content online, that's fine. But if you want to be successful, you need to have a differentiator. And if you have that differentiator, the world always has room for something that is better, something either that is new that people want or something that is better. And I many times in the book talk about the parallels between content or putting content online and products, because effectively writing content or creating a newsletter or publication is a product. It's creating something that people want or need, solving a problem for people. And so it's writing itself is just a medium or a way to do that. And so if you think about products, you could say the same thing about startups, right? Like the number of startups that exist today is, I don't know the number, many multiples higher than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But does that mean that we should not create startups anymore? No, the reason that we continue to create startups is because new problems exist. So as new problems emerge, new solutions need to emerge as well. Or there are many cases, and this is actually the majority of cases, there needs to be better startups solving the same problems. And so that's why, for example, in technology, like there are new banks all the time, new like digital neobanks launching all the time. Just because there's 5 of them in a particular country, does that mean that they can't have a 6th? If the 6th is not any better than the first 5, then we don't need that. But if the 6 is actually tangibly even just 1% better than the existing 5, then the world does have room for that, and the world actually wants that. And so the same thing is true with content, right? So if you're just putting content online and you have no differentiator or actual edge above what exists out there right now, then I actually wouldn't say someone should put content online, because they're not adding to the existing system. But if you're able to find that edge, or again, find something that people aren't targeting, but that second part is actually much harder, then you should put content online, because you're solving problems more effectively than people who currently exist online are.
And I love that framing. And I think you're right. Not everybody, a lot of the new content that's being posted is a photo of the burrito I just ate. And it's not just terribly compelling, but it obviously shows up in the stats as another image shared on Instagram. So I'm really curious about that edge. How do you think about having an edge online with your writing in this case? What are some of the ways that you can really stand out and, like you said, solve problems for people and actually add unique value?
Sure. So again, there's 2 ways to view it. So there's either you find something that people aren't solving, but that's incredibly hard to do, right? Both with products and with content. So if you can find that, great. But just keep in mind that if no one is participating somewhere, there may be a reason why people aren't participating there. Either that people don't actually want that thing, or it's incredibly hard to actually solve it. So let's shelve that first thing. The more approachable, but sometimes people stray away from this because it sounds less approachable, is to actually just find something where that people are competing. There is content that exists there, but considering where can I be better? Better is something that you can transform into any adjective, right? So you can be, a lot of people think, okay, better would mean higher quality. And that is one way you can differentiate, right? If your writing and your research or whatever you're putting online is better quality, that is one way to be better. But you can also be funnier. You can be more opinionated. You can be more visual. You can be all of these things. And again, I like to view it as an adjective, right? Because one thing that people do wrong, or maybe not wrong, but they focus on too much, is when they're identifying where to differentiate, they focus on what they're creating. And so they're saying, like, I'm going to create a newsletter about this topic. And that's great. You do need to identify exactly what you're writing about. But what is just as important, and what most people kind of skim over, is how they're actually writing about that thing. And if you think about how people actually communicate their preferences for products and for newsletters or any sort of written content, they talk about what it does differently, why they subscribe to this newsletter. It's punchy. I love seeing it in my inbox. Like, I save 5 minutes versus all the other newsletters. It's how they're actually communicating the information, not necessarily the information itself and like the topic that it's focusing on. And so that's really important for you. If you're trying to figure out where you can differentiate, you need to find that edge. And again, it can be higher quality. That's often the edge that people gravitate towards, at least at the beginning, if they don't know what other edges they can have. But I know of tons of other written content that differentiates, like The Hustle. And say most of the time, The Hustle, people say, we write about business and tech, super competitive space. They say our differentiator is our voice. They feel like we make things that are not so entertaining. And other newsletters and business and tech have other differentiators, and people gravitate towards them for that reason. And the other final thing I'll say here, to use another product as an example, or company, is Costco. I love this example. I learned this in consulting years ago. So what people misunderstand is that people often try to be just really decent at everything, right? If you took the average of all things that you could be, you're pretty high quality, you're pretty funny, you're pretty concise, all these things, and you're like, my newsletter is pretty good. But people don't choose products based on the average of things that they might care about. They choose products based on the single thing that they care the most about, and which one does that best. So to use Costco as an example, Costco went into an incredibly competitive space, general retail, right, where there were many players that existed for much longer than they did, who had much more money, at least to begin with, than they did. And what they did is, it's funny because it took years for me to even clue in on this, but Costco is such a common name that we forget. It literally has the word cost in it. That is the one thing that they differentiate on. And if you actually read their mission statement, there's all these companies with super complex mission statements, and theirs is something along the lines of, we sell our customers like the goods and services at the cheapest prices, or something like that. It's very clear that this is the one thing that they do better. And the reason I like Costco as an example is because they do everything, or they actually give up many things in order to trade on this price point better than anyone else. So if you've ever been to a Costco, they're hard to get to. It's literally a warehouse. So it's like store ambiance, which is something that some retailers care about, Costco doesn't care about. Their package size is another thing that people might care about. No one wants a 4-pack of Q-tips, but Costco is taking all of these things. You don't get store service within Costco. Like, when has that anyone ever helped you within a Costco? But because people care about one thing in this part, or some subset of customers care about this one thing, which is price, they've traded off all of these other things to be the absolute best in price. And for the people that care about price, they choose Costco. And so that you can take the same parallel with content, where basically find one thing that people care about within your industry, within your niche, the thing that you're writing about, and trade on that. Become the absolute best at that thing. Do not try to be the average of all the things that people might care about.
That's incredible. Yeah, I just heard the story of Costco is such a great example, especially with, you can point to all these trade-offs. I heard the story of when the new CEO of Costco took over in 2012, he wanted to raise the price of their hot dog combo.
I saw that, right?
Yeah.
He's like, I will fire you or something like that if you touch the hot dog price.
Exactly. Yeah. The former co-founder said exactly that. I will kill you if you raise the price. So that really shows their dedication to this one vector. So I love that example. So I'm curious, I feel like it segues a little bit into the idea of K factor in content, and how to think about maybe not only your voice in general, your framing in general, but also in an individual piece of content, maybe how to think about writing something that is actually inherently worth sharing and is maybe more likely to succeed. And maybe that's a bit broad, but I'm curious to hear you explain a little bit more about the concept of kind of K factor and virality in content and in writing itself.
Sure. I guess there's two things to mention. One of them is just this factor of, like, similar to being really good, your overall publication being really good, each piece of content needs to be really good. If you imagine like how much content is out there right now, in order for a single piece of content to stand out, it's playing against millions of other pieces of content in a given day. And because we now have access through the internet, instead of, just to go back to that newspaper example, in the past, if I grew up in the 1950s, my content would only be competing with anyone else who potentially would write for the Toronto Star. Now I'm competing with everyone in the world and the content they're creating. And with that selection that we now have as consumers, we only are going to engage with the best stuff. And so there's no point in putting out something that's mediocre. There's really no point, because it's not a linear thing where something that is even like average gets half of something that's above average. It's 0 or nothing, basically, or it's a very exponential curve. And so when you're putting out any piece of content, there's no point in creating, let's say, 5 articles that are average. Instead, you should be spending your time to put together one article that's amazing. And obviously there's some nuance there, but just the point is that you should be trying to stay above a threshold of something that can stand out amongst the crowd. Now, once you've done that, something else to keep in mind is just this concept that you mentioned, which is like, what would cause someone to share this? And something that I think people misunderstand about shareability or virality is they think like virality means that you're surprising someone, or that it's something that people have never heard of. In reality, virality happens based on you solving a micro problem for someone. And that micro problem comes in different forms. So one example is that they're surprised, right? They're like, this is like playing to the like animal part of my brain where I'm like excited by this. This is like arousing me because I've never seen this before. So that's one potential problem that you can solve for people. But you can also solve micro problems for people like, oh, this is actually something I've been thinking about for a really long time. This is a concept that I haven't been able to like distill in my own mind. And therefore this article does this very well. So now that it's distilled it for me, I feel cool sharing this and letting other people know that this is something that like solved a micro problem for me and will solve a micro problem for you. And so when you're creating content, just consider this kind of nuance. It's hard to articulate sometimes, but this concept of like, there we go. Yeah, just think about, is this something that solves any problem for someone? Like, why would someone want to engage with this? Why would someone want to stop what they're doing in their life and engage with my content? And then also on top of that, is this something that someone would want to share? If you can create something that people want to share and really think about that, like, is there any reason that someone would want to share this with someone else? And if there's not, just consider how you can actually make your content fit that mold. And yeah, that's how I would view things. It has to be really good, but also just consider the person reading it, or the person sitting, at their desk in the morning deciding what they want to read. Why would they engage with your content over the like sea of content out there? And if you can't answer that question, then that's something that you should work on.
I love that. And that's what I hear you saying is like you want from the outset to maximize the probability of something really catching on. And there are different ways of doing that, but you do have to be intentional up front, because if I told you some really interesting and useful thing, we were talking about Luma as this really great, useful registration page product. I'm just going to be inclined to share that as something where I know you might be solving similar issues. I've come across this wonderful resource. I'm going to hand it over to you. And really, what I read in your book is no amount of hacking or trying to get folks to just like artificially promote your stuff. Ultimately, that'll trickle out and fail if the thing itself is not really delivering value. And so you have to start from this foundation. But in the book, you also talk about like channel risk and actually being really intentional with distribution. So I guess I'm curious to maybe just start at a high level, but assuming that I've invested my time and focus on writing something that I really do think is useful, that I really do think is going to help people, what should be the next sorts of things that I think about when it comes to distribution and finding readers?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that you want to do there is identify who your readers are. So I talk about this like concept that I did not invent, but this 100 true fans concept of who you may have multiple audiences or like multiple segments of your audience, but what is the core person that you're actually trying to reach? And the way that you can define that is just like, of all the people out there, who are the people that get the most like concrete benefit from the thing that you're creating? And so once you identify those people, then you can start to think about who are these people, what do they do, where do they hang out, and like talking about like channel risk is, can I actually reach these people in some scalable way? At the beginning, it doesn't need to be scalable, but you do want to think a little bit further past like your 100 true fans and think about, if I want to grow past 100 subscribers, this group exists past just 100 people. How do I reach these people? What channels do I have access to? And do I really think that I can reach these people? That's something that like people don't sit there and think about. They just say, I'm going to create content and I'll find a way to reach people later, which can work, but it's just worth taking the time to be like, okay, this is clearly my audience and I know they hang out here and here. And so I'm going to like see if I can actually reach them through these mediums. And just like taking a bit of time to contemplate that at the beginning is really important. And then tied to the audience thing, what people often don't do is get really nitty gritty about who their audience is. People will be like, I'm targeting people in tech. And it's like, who in tech? Like tech is a huge space. So are you targeting what age demographic? Are you segmenting based on people who like create technology? Are you segmenting based on people who just find business and technology interesting? Are you segmenting based on like VCs who invest in tech? Like, who are you segmenting? What problems do they face? And like, why are you targeting these people? Do you really think that you are creating content that's valuable for them or not? So I would just advise people to go through that exercise before even starting to distribute, because that exercise actually makes it easier to figure out what your distribution channels are, because you know who you're trying to reach and not just like aimlessly throwing your content online and hoping that it reaches the right people.
Yeah, and how do you, I'm curious, how do you think about the different kind of layers or in the book you mentioned the idea of like early on experimenting with quite a few different channels and like keeping an open mind with what might work. And then maybe over time starting to be a bit more strategic about how you approach distribution. I'd be curious to just hear you explain both how to initially maybe test the waters and test out your theories of where these people hang out. And then as time goes on, really find your bedrock channels. I'm curious to hear your kind of explanation of both.
Sure. So yeah, in the book, I talk about 6 different types of channels. And so that plays into this. There's different types of channels that are more like bedrock or foundational that you can build up over time. There's viral channels that people naturally gravitate towards too, because they hit your dopamine centers and you feel really good when you get a bunch of people looking at it, but they die out super quickly. There's like niche communities. There's 6 different ones. We don't need to go through all of them, but what's important to understand is, one, how you basically explore and exploit different ones, right? So at the beginning, you need to go test out quite a few channels to see what actually resonates, like where your content resonates the most. And then once you figure that out, like for example, some newsletters that are highly visual, this isn't surprising, like actually use channels like Instagram to grow their newsletters, versus I don't do anything on Instagram because my content doesn't play well there. And so there's so many channels that you can actually go target, so many niche communities that you need to go out and explore, right? So test a bunch of them. And then once you figure out like your top, handful that actually play towards your strengths and people resonate with, then you actually exploit and you focus on those. But the other thing to keep in mind is that your actual distribution techniques will change over time based on like how big your audience is. And so in the beginnings, the one thing that people get wrong often is they're like, I'm at 30 subscribers, how do I get to 1,000? And it's you probably need to pivot 2 or 3 times in that path, where at the beginning, when you're at 30 subscribers, your goal is to get to 31. And so that in products, people often talk about doing things that don't scale at the beginning. The same thing is true with newsletters. If you go on, there's this Substack forum that I linked in the book, which is basically Substack asked people like, how did you get your first subscribers? And all of them were non-scalable techniques. So it was like my friends or Gmail subscribers or like LinkedIn contacts or just like talking to people. Morning Brew, pretty big newsletter that I'm sure most people know, would go to universities and talk to their classes. That's like not scalable at all. But when you're first starting out, you're A, doing things that don't scale, and B, you're targeting a much smaller segment of people. Remember that 100 true fans of yours that can really get behind what you're doing. And then as you grow, you expand both in terms of your audience, but also in terms of the techniques. And then you can transition to more scalable forms. Something else to keep in mind is that a whole chapter in the book is dedicated to SEO, and that's something that I think people miss out on a lot. But there's certain channels like SEO just won't happen right away. And so you can focus on the non-scalable things at first, and then slowly, as you're investing in SEO, like 6 months to even a year down the line, you'll start to see some of that kind of come back to benefit you. And so it's a mix of a bunch of different things, but I guess the concepts that I mentioned are that at the beginning, you do things that don't scale and slowly pivot to things that do scale. And then along that way, you're testing a bunch of different channels, finding which ones actually resonate with your audience and what is, working, what's driving success for you. And then you focus on those channels and you ignore the rest. You don't want to be at a point where you're thousands of subscribers and you're dependent on posting across like 20 different mediums every day. Like you want to have certain channels that do have more of a bedrock that you build up over time. But in order to find them, you need to explore first.
Yeah, and quickly, in a couple minutes, we'll switch to Q&A. So if folks have questions, like literally anything, just start dropping them in the chat. If you're able to, when we go to Q&A, you can unmute and ask your question. Otherwise, I'm happy to read it. But anything that's coming up that you just want to dive into, go ahead and start pasting it in the chat. So one thing I was really curious about with distribution are like, I guess maybe what's overlooked channels might be. So assuming that you're writing really useful things, assuming that you actually have clearly identified who you want to reach, what are maybe some like surprising or overlooked distribution channels, maybe outside of, I know I should be tweeting more, like I know I should be using Twitter. Are there any places, you mentioned SEO briefly, but is there anywhere else where maybe it doesn't even cross a lot of people's minds? And I'll have one follow-up after that and we'll go into Q&A.
Yeah, so I'm going to pull up the book because I can also see someone in the Q&A talking about the 6 different types of channels, and I want to make sure that I'm going over them in the right order so I can explain them best. Great. But to your point, so let me quickly just talk about how a lot of people focus on 2 types of channels first. I'll talk about that as I'm pulling this up. Sorry, guys. So the 2 types of channels that people tend to focus on are social and what I call viral channels, because those are the easiest to get started on, and those are also play to your dopamine centers of what can make you very happy quickly, right, without much effort. And so to talk about both of them, like social is pretty straightforward, right? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these channels run by algorithms, very social focused. So like you're not necessarily a company. You're posting about not just your content often, you're posting about other things that you care about. Social is great. I found Twitter to personally work super well for me, but social can take a lot of time to actually build up. And I think in general, people should see social as more of a longer term game instead of like at the beginning when people first gravitate towards social, like you're not going to get any success right away. So I do think there is a place for social, but the other thing to keep in mind with social, I talk about this codes framework in the book, which is about how different channels, like how to basically evaluate different channels. And it's basically cost, ownership, dependability, effort, and scalability. So social is super scalable, which is awesome, but you don't own anything. And so what that means is basically Facebook or Google or all these other companies own the platforms. So you want to be careful that as you're building up social, that's not the only platform that you're focusing on. The other place that people focus on a lot in the beginning is viral channels, which are basically channels that like Hacker News, where basically if you trend there, you get 30,000 page views in a given day, and that's awesome. I know in 2019, that was like a goal of mine. And now I think that's like a very silly goal to have looking back, but people shoot for these things because it does make you very happy, and it can also accelerate your success at the beginning. So there's nothing wrong with targeting viral channels, but the thing that you want to keep in mind is that these things die out, right? Social can have some form of that bedrock, but viral channels, like you get a Hacker News feature and the next day, guess what? That you don't have a Hacker News feature. And so you want to build up your publication so that you actually aren't just like spray and praying, right? Like hoping that things will happen. You want to be able to wake up tomorrow and know what traffic you're going to get. So the other channels are bedrock channels, syndicate channels, targeted channels, and paid channels. So I'll quickly go through them in reverse order, actually. So paid channel is pretty straightforward. If you have the money, they can be good. The hustle relies a lot on paid acquisitions. A newsletter like Morning Brew, those obviously, the downside is that you like have to pay for your page views or your attention. And then the other downside with paid is similar to something like viral, like it only works while you're paying. And so it can definitely accelerate your success, but it's not something that necessarily you can invest in and actually like see payouts later on. Targeted channels are things like communities. So finding niche communities, whether they're Slack communities, Telegram communities, Facebook communities, there's tons of different communities. These are really good at the beginning. These are not scalable by any means in terms of like later on, but at the beginning, these are really good because that's when you're targeting your 100 true fans. And so at the beginning, when you're trying to find very specific people that can get behind you, it's very hard to find that on social. It's very hard to find them through paid acquisition and things like that. This is when you really want to build up a community. And actually, when you focus on targeted channels at the beginning, this can help you, this can benefit you when you're building up your social following and things like that in the future. So targeted is really good at the beginning, but I wouldn't say something that is scalable once you start to get bigger. Syndicate channels are like a mix between bedrock and social. These are channels like YouTube, Pinterest. These are channels where basically you're taking your content and repurposing it. So you're putting it on another channel. So with the example of Pinterest, you're actually like making it more visual. You're putting it on Pinterest. These channels, the reason I say they're between bedrock and social is because they have a bedrock element to it. So if you put something on Pinterest over time, it's almost like having stuff on Google, right? The problem with syndicate channels is that it can take a lot more work, right? So for you to actually go and create something to put on Pinterest or to recreate a video to put on YouTube or create an adjacent podcast, this can take time. And the final one is my favorite because this is it's amongst the codes framework. I think it's the best of all worlds. And these are basically channels that build up over time that you own for the most part and don't take that much more work for you. The only downside of these is that they can take a long time to build up, but I think they're the most sustainable ways to build your publication. So the obvious one is a newsletter, right? So over time, like you own that. You bring everyone through your newsletter. You can control if you are posting an article, you know exactly how many people that article is reaching versus if you post on social, you don't know if the algorithm is going to actually, play to that article or not. The other ones that are also bedrock are things like referral programs, right? So that's something that a lot of people miss out on. You can start that right away with almost no money. I think there's what's the one, I talk about it in the book, but the Run referral tool that, did you know Louis Nichols, he started it, but I'm totally blanking on the name.
Ooh, I wonder.
Sparkloop, there we go. Jack said it. Yeah, Sparkloop.
Nice.
So yeah, you can use Sparkloop so that you don't actually have to put the text together. So that's something, bedrock channels to me are the no-brainer channels. So all these other ones you want to explore and exploit. Bedrock channels are get your newsletter obviously together, optimize your modals, all that stuff. Get a referral program started, even if you're young and you don't have that many subscribers. And then the other one that I mentioned before that people just don't invest in enough is SEO. Because to take that example from Hacker News, think about it this way. If you wanted to get to a point where you're bringing in 30,000 page views a day for your publication, there are many ways to get there, right? You could pay for them, in which case, if you're assuming 10-cent clicks, I think I did the math, it's like around $1 million a year. So if you got $1 million, maybe that can help you accelerate things, but that's very expensive. You can hope for a Hacker News feature every single day. I don't think anyone on this earth has managed to do that. So it's very non-repeatable, and you can't wake up and say, I know how my publication is going to do today. On the other hand, bedrock channels, you do. Every layer that you add, even though it's slow, you're adding. It's additive. And in which case, over time, you can view 30,000 page views as with something like SEO, that's actually just, 30 articles with 1,000 page views in a day, or 60 articles with 500 page views in a day. And you can keep doing that math where it does take effort, but that is actually where I think if you are considering building a publication for the long haul, where you actually want to be successful past a couple of viral features, you want to invest in bedrock channels as much as possible. I don't know if I actually even answered the original question, but that's how I think about channels, and how, again, something when you're starting out, targeted channels are great, but over time, I would say the best bet is to invest in bedrock channels alongside something like social.
Fantastic. No, that was excellent. Because I think a lot of these, you mentioned social and viral as two obvious ones that people gravitate towards, but I think you're right. These other four channels are probably often overlooked. And that answers actually one of the questions in the Q&A, which we'll go to now. So actually, Matthew Weeks, I don't know if you're able to unmute, but I love your question. I think we could maybe start there. If you're not, no problem. I can go ahead and ask it. Let's see. I will do the deed. But go for it, please.
Hey, sorry. Oh, yeah. So yeah, I recently just started a blog, but I've been writing for the greater part of, 6 years, 7 years. I just never published any of it because I was always trying to get better and get better. And so I've started publishing, but now I'm struggling with that, trying to build the regular habit in addition to focusing on long-term, actually making this into a potential business or revenue generator of some sort. So I know your advice is a lot around using, focusing on high quality content. So I'm curious what your opinion is on, say, using something like Medium or a platform where it's a little bit lower barrier to entry as maybe shorter content generation, just regularly doing it, and then building out those bigger pieces over time. I noticed that a lot of your writing is very detailed, very well researched, and there's just a lot that goes into it. And it feels like that's hard to get to as a first step, I find. Yeah, that's, but sure. Thanks. I love the book, by the way.
Thanks, Matthew. So I guess there's a couple questions baked in there. I'll try to answer all of them. But so first, before I even get into the question, I wouldn't suggest you use Medium. I think idea, everything that you create should at least have some form of ownership that you're building up. You're building up your own foundation. Medium does not allow you to do that. And so what I would suggest, and I talked about this in the book, have your own blog where whatever platform you want to use, there's tons. And then Medium allows you to post on Medium after and import it with the canonical, in which case you're not hindering your ability to grow on either end. And so I would advise you to use Medium for that and not have that be your core platform. Now, as it relates to quality over time, yeah, I think my particular publication has focused on long-form content, and just by the nature of the topics that I'm writing about or what I'm trying to communicate, they end up being really long. But I want to be very clear that quality does not mean length. This is something that people get confused all the time with, which is basically quality means, again, if we go back to the fact that writing is just a medium or tool for providing solutions to people that have problems, the best content, the highest quality content, is providing them the shortest solution that is the most thorough, though. So providing them with something that actually solves their problem the best. In some cases, that means you do need to write a lot in order to facilitate that providing the best solution. But length is not an indicator, or it's not always an indicator of something that is high quality. It's high quality means actually satisfying someone's need. And so when it comes to actually writing things that are high quality, or if you're trying to get to that point, I would actually focus instead of on length or feeling like you need to deeply research stuff. I would start with what you're actually really good at. So what are things that you actually just by nature know better than most people in this world? And if you can do that, you don't necessarily need to write something super long, and it'll come much easier to you because you actually do know this very well. When I first started, I now ventured into many more topics, but when I first started, many of the articles I was writing about were on remote work because I had worked remotely for many years before many people were. And when I searched for these topics, a lot of the content that was surfacing was really low quality, at least in my opinion. Not necessarily short, but just low quality stuff that I didn't actually feel like was satisfying someone's need. And so if you ever do that, if you ever are thinking about something and you stumble upon a particular space and you look in that space and that nothing there is really satisfying your needs, that's an amazing signal that you can actually go and satisfy that need for other people. And so I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I would actually just focus not necessarily on perfectionism in terms of length or even like having everything grammatically perfect. To use my book as an example, I wrote that thing in 49 days and I edited it once through. And so there are so many errors, like so many small like typos that people have reached out to me on. But because the actual book, at least it seems like, is satisfying people's need in terms of teaching them the things that they wanted to learn, they can look past some of these like typos or minor things that I will fix, but like they're not actually that important when you're focusing on actually just solving someone's needs. So I would focus on that. So always finding who your audience is, solving their needs, and not focusing on these kind of metrics that sometimes align with quality, but by nature are not in itself. Those are like length and grammar are not necessarily quality in itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So in terms of the syndication to Medium, do you think it makes sense to just post every like tiny piece of like content to like a syndication network like that?
It depends. For example, if you're writing a newsletter, like The Hustle would never post. The Hustle does 3 to 5 briefs every day about something that is in the news for that particular day. I wouldn't post those, but if anything can stand on its own as a piece of content, it doesn't matter how long or short it is, then you can definitely post to Medium. Also, posting to Medium is because of the way Medium runs their network. Medium only really surfaces the best stuff. And there's no harm in posting there, but it's also, I don't know if you want to spend your time posting stuff there that you don't think can actually do well on the platform. But I think of Medium as a channel, right? I don't think of Medium as like where you should put your blog. It's like a channel. And similar to what I said before, you want to figure out if your type of content actually gets traction on Medium or not. And if it doesn't, I wouldn't spend too much time there.
Awesome. Great question. So I think, Philip, you had a question around like how to maybe write something that is contrarian or at least will incite some interest and do it in a tasteful way. So if you're able to unmute, feel free. Otherwise, I'm happy to ask your question. And I'll go ahead and ask it. Philip had a question around if you are going to maybe write something that's contrarian or like maybe is a touchy subject that's interesting, how do you make sure you do it in a way that actually doesn't incite rage and gets a right sort of virality and the right sort of interest? Curious if you have any kind of advice or guidance on something like that.
Sure. I don't know if I'm an expert on this, but I would say that you should never, or in my opinion, you should never be like seeking to be contrarian. I think that's something that like people now do because it sounds cool, and people in tech say that you must be contrarian to be a good startup investor or to find the best ideas within, if you want to be a founder and stuff like that. I think that's just something that people say in hindsight, and like, we were contrarian because this like idea worked out. But I think in reality, the best way to be contrarian, what does contrarian mean? Let's actually go to that. Contrarian means that something that other people, or like you think something that other people don't believe. Now, you can be contrarian in this may sound harsh, dumb way, in which case like you just think things because you believe this and everyone else tends to believe this. But the better way to be contrarian is actually to be an expert in something. And therefore that by nature, you are at least to some degree contrarian because of something that others do not know. It's much better to be contrarian from a place where you actually are contrarian because of something that most of the world doesn't know versus just being contrarian to be difficult or to be different. Do you know what I mean? And so the best way to be contrarian in a way that's interesting online is just become an expert in a particular space and write about that. And then by nature, people like who don't know as much about the particular topic may actually find your piece contrarian, but may want to like engage in intellectual debate with you for that reason. But also the only thing I would say here is that contrarian is like a good form of contrarian writing is being an expert somewhere, but also like you must have an opinion, right? So you can be an expert somewhere and just say, this is how you build this app in Node.js. And that's not contrarian because there's no opinion there. So the way to be contrarian is to be an expert somewhere. A good contrarian is to be an expert somewhere and to have an opinion that people can debate with you on. So that's how I would put that, thinking about it from that lens and not just trying to be contrarian.
Yeah, I think that's great framing. I always think of the Basecamp founders as like fairly contrarian and I think controversial in a certain way, in a healthy, productive way that I think gets maybe the right sort of attention, even if inevitably some mud gets slung.
That's a great example because you know how they became contrarian, they became an expert. So DHH was working remotely from, I believe, early 2000s, in which case, like by the time people were actually coming around to remote work, like he had been an expert in remote work and how to build remote teams and why this actually made way more sense long before everyone else. And so he could have written about that just at a high level, but instead the reason he was contrarian was because of the mix of his deep expertise in this space, but also because he takes a very strong opinion. So that's, I think, really the intersection that if you're trying to be contrarian, that's what you're trying to approach.
Yeah, well said. I think Jack Conway, you are up if you're able to unmute, and I think this should successfully work here. Jack, feel free to take the floor.
Awesome, thanks. Hey, Steph, yeah, this has been really great. Thank you for doing this.
Okay.
So you write for your day job, and then I think also for your personal blog and newsletter, and I'd just love to hear you talk about how you compartmentalize those two things, and if there's any way you have rituals or routines switching from one to the other.
It's a good question, and I get asked this a lot, and I don't have a good answer, unfortunately, despite being asked it a lot. I've never been that much of a like highly routined individual. The one piece of advice that I would give to people overall is that I think, and this is just in general to like speaking to if you are working on things within like a work context and then you also want to work on things in your personal life, the thing that I think a lot of people miss out on is with your personal life or your personal projects, setting the same kind of goals that you would set in a work environment. And what I mean by that is like within work, you're quick to set like KPIs or OKRs, or like by this point, we're going to have this much progress and you have a roadmap and all these things. And whenever we either do indie hacking or even just think of like our own goals in our personal life, I feel like most people at max will sit down and over an hour and be like, this is what I'm going to do for the next quarter. And then many people don't even do that. And so the reason I say this is to have like very concrete goals is because when you think about your priorities at a given micro instance, whether, especially if you work remotely, the lines are blurred between like your work and your life. At any micro instance, if you have clear goals that you're trying to meet in one part of your life, which is work, and no clear goals that you're trying to meet in the other part of your life, your brain just works in a way such that you would be like, oh, if I do like an extra hour of work on this project within work, I'll get closer to my goals, which may even have like financial bonuses or incentives. So if you don't have any clear goals or tracking or metrics within your personal life or your personal projects, that is always going to be deprioritized, whether you mean to or not. So that's how I've managed to balance my own projects that I care about with things in work, which I also care about. You just need to make sure that you have goals on both ends and that you're actually quantifying those goals. So something that I did for a while that I do less of now is I literally just had a spreadsheet where I would track like in my personal life, what are the things that I cared about? And it was anything from writing to learning to code. I did that for a year, to like flossing, like something that we all struggle with that like we should do because we care about our teeth. I had that. I literally tracked like when I floss. And some people think when I tell people this, they're like, that sounds really obsessive. And I actually am like a very disorganized person, but this is one way for me to just say, if I really care about these things, let me at least see how I'm doing. I don't manage to do all these things every day, but now I actually have a record for myself to reflect on what is actually being accomplished in my own personal life. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't actually have that many rituals or routines other than making sure that I set goals and track them in a quantitative way.
That was super helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Great question. I think Eugene, if you're able to unmute, you are next, but I'm more than happy to ask these. Yeah, go for it.
Thanks to you. Hi, Steph. I'm a great fan of your writing on your blog. You just take what everyone knows, but just haven't distilled it well enough. And that's how things like you wrote about greatness and how to create things. So I'm really curious about how you thought about your 100 true fans when you started writing in 2019. And then were the articles that really resonated with the world, were they targeted at your 100 true fans? And how did your 100 true fans change since then? And who are your 100 true fans now? And how are you thinking about creating content based on the feedback that you get from how people resonate, how your article resonates? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you for the kind words. So my So something to keep in mind is the 100 True Fans, again, it's a way for you to get started. It's a way for you to really nail down who you're trying to target and what problems you're trying to solve for what people. But once you actually start growing, it's natural that like you have many people who will be interested in your content that aren't necessarily within your True Fans. And you can start to expand in terms of topics and in terms of the people that you're actually targeting, but it's just something to help you really get like a grasp of things at the beginning. So for me at the beginning, it was really, it sounds silly, but my 100 True Fans were like clones of me, digital nomads who were like indie hacking, which is a very small audience, but an audience that existed, an audience that I knew super well, and an audience that tended to, like, if they're a nomad and they're indie hacking, like they work remotely, so they care about things like working remotely. And so that's really the approximate description of what my True Fans were at the beginning. That's why I wrote about topics like remote work, but also things like learning to code, because this niche audience, actually, they may have not all been interested in every article that I wrote, but I understood who this person was because I was around them in co-working spaces in Asia. I was this person. So I understood that even though the topics I were writing about to someone who's not in the audience maybe would have seemed very scattered, I knew who this person was because I was that person. And there was many other people like me who were working in Bali that also wanted to learn to code, that also worked remotely and wanted to find out like how to do that better. And so that was my persona. And then since then it's expanded to almost, I sometimes explain this 100 True Fans concept by like it being your primary audience. So you have people who, again, who benefit from your solution the most. And then often there's an aspiring audience, and then there's a tangential audience. So the aspiring audience would be people who maybe work in tech that want to become a nomad or want more freedom, want to improve their life. So that's how I've expanded right to that aspiring audience. And then there's almost like a tangential audience who someone may not want to become a nomad. They may not want to learn to code, but they in general find improving their life. They find like personal development interesting. They probably either work in tech or at least keep up with tech a little bit. And so that's like the tertiary audience for me. And then because my personal publication has grown, I've been able to venture outside of just targeting that primary audience and writing for anything that the secondary audience or the kind of tertiary audience would also be interested in. And this spans not just like for my example, but an example that people understand better is typically like, if you're writing for entrepreneurs, are you writing for someone who is an entrepreneur now? Are you writing for someone who's been an entrepreneur for years? Are you writing for someone who wants to aspire to be an entrepreneur? Are you writing for someone who invests in entrepreneurs or someone who just happens to be in business and entrepreneurship overall? What I normally say is that you should find the most the most expert level version within that, which in this case, the entrepreneurship case, you would target mostly people who are entrepreneurs and have been doing it for a while, because by nature, you will capture people who are aspiring entrepreneurs or who care about entrepreneurship or who invest in great entrepreneurs. Versus if you had chosen one of those other tangential or aspiring audiences, you wouldn't be able to capture the other ones as effectively. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you very
No
much.
problem.
Excellent question. I know we're like coming up on time, and unfortunately we won't get through all the awesome questions in the Q&A. Just for the sake of time, I'll read one more. And
I'm also happy to stay after if you guys need a little bit more time, but I don't know if Stu, if you have
oh, amazing. No, I think I'm cool to hang for a bit longer as well. So anyone who wants to hang after the hour, cool. Thanks for the generous offer. We'll definitely do it.
Sure.
So in that case, Razul, you can tell me if you can unmute. Otherwise, I'm happy to read this. Sorry to put you on the spot, but the question is, I'll just go ahead and read it. The question.
I can read it. Sorry.
Oh, perfect. Cool. Yeah, go for it.
I think you mentioned in one of the previous questions, actually, so it can relate. You mentioned that writing needs to be opinionated in order to not gain some traction, but basically to start a conversation. And so my first question is, do you agree with this? And obviously you do, since you mentioned. But to the second question is, how would you go about developing that opinion? So take me, for example. I write like a coding tutorial. Those are obviously not opinionated, and I don't really have a strong opinion on things, and rather I avoid it sometimes just to don't get too strong of a reaction. But how would you go about developing strong quote unquote opinion?
Sure. So let me clarify that I don't necessarily think that you need a strong opinion to successfully write online or for things to go viral. That was specifically related to if you want to be contrarian in which so let me articulate something that I mentioned before, which is for something to go viral, there are many reasons that it goes viral, but there needs to be some reason that someone is sharing it. One of those reasons is that can be that something is contrarian and someone like either deeply agrees or deeply disagrees with something that they're reading, or there are other reasons why things go viral as this thing took me by surprise, or this is just exactly, again, what I was looking for, so long to articulate what I've been thinking, or this is just an amazing tutorial that I think everyone needs to see. There's so many reasons why things go viral. So in order to go have something go viral because you want it to be contrarian and to start a conversation, that's when I think you need some sort of opinion. But if you're just writing about coding tutorials, I don't think you need an opinion. There are many successful coding tutorials that have no opinion. I've written some of them as well that there's no opinion attached to that. And if you are writing something that isn't opinionated, you can't necessarily have your stuff go viral along that contrarian route. But then I would just go back to the earlier question of think about what is the cause or what would be the cause of someone wanting to share this, and then focus on optimizing for that. And in your case, it wouldn't be that it's contrarian. It would probably be that it's like super deeply or super high quality where it's the best coding tutorial anyone's ever seen. Or it could be something like it's for beginners and this is like the best tutorial for someone to get started when everything out there is super complicated. Or it's the most actionable tutorial where like someone gets through it and by the end they've built some super cool application, versus most tutorials tend to like just teach you a particular like piece of technology but not actually how to use it. Those are just a couple ideas of what you can become better at. But just to reiterate, you don't need to have an opinion. It's only if you're trying to, I can't remember who asked it, but if you're trying to be contrarian and try to solicit a contrarian response.
Yeah. I guess I wasn't very clear. I'm not trying to make my tutorials very opinionated because I mean, it's useless, right? You just write about what you do and then people can learn on that. But what I meant is that, let's say I want to not only write those tutorial type of posts, but rather, and not teaching type of posts, but rather actually share an opinion, which what are famous writers now, David Frill and stuff, right? They would usually share their opinion on something like this. And so I was wondering if you ever thought about it, how would you go about starting to form an opinion on things so you can share it with the world, if it makes any sense? And if it doesn't,
Yeah.
it's fine.
No, it does. And I think I would go back to what I said before, which is just that the best way to form anyone can form an opinion in a second, but is that opinion like formed off of anything? If you form it in a second, no. But if it's something that you have spent a lot of time with to become an expert in, that is a great place to be, because then your opinion comes from a place of expertise, not just thin air. And in that case, like to just give a couple examples from my blog, I wrote about remote work, and one of the first articles I ever wrote was this it was like the guide to remote work that isn't trying to sell you anything. And it came from a place because I had worked remotely for several years and everyone writing about remote work was like trying to sell a course or something. And I just came from this place where I'm like, to be a quote unquote digital nomad, like you just buy a plane ticket and you go. And I could only have gotten to that place of like clarity because I had done it and many people hadn't done it. And then the article talks about many more things, but it came from a place of I've actually done this and studied it and thought about it for a really long time. So I can have an opinion on this, right? And similarly, like one of my most well-known articles is How to Be Great One. And that came from a place of studying entrepreneurs. I work with a bunch of entrepreneurs in my job. I personally have been creating for the last couple of years. And I've just over time recognized that there's this like fallacy of overnight success. And I could have read about that in a book, but the reason I was able to write about it, I think in a way that resonated with so many people, is because I'd lived that for the last several years. And I, in some way, shape, or form, become a form of an expert in that. So the best way to, again, anyone can have an opinion, but the best way to have your opinions hold water is to go and become an expert in that particular thing.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Great question. And I think, Corinna, I don't know if you're able to unmute, but I know you had a few questions. Love to have you ask whatever's top of mind.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Steph. Yeah, I had 3 questions. Maybe I'll just pick one. The one I was most interested in is I'm currently like thinking about additional channels or additional forms of content in addition to like writing, and specifically something that can be monetized. Ideally, something that can sit there and hopefully get some passive revenue from it. So like like an online course, like a paid course, video podcast, something like that. Do you have any ideas on where to start? I'm very early on in that thinking, so I'm really happy just for any ideas, or if you tried something that worked really well, I'd love to hear that.
Sure. It's a big question because there are so many things that you can do to make passive income. But what I would advise you to do, if you haven't already, is first to just if you don't know what to build to monetize, just start building an audience first. That's what I did for 2 years before selling this book. Is I didn't know what I wanted to build or what I wanted to sell. So if you of course, this doesn't work if you don't have the financial runway to do that, and your goal is really to just make money quickly, then the answer is different. Now, if that is the case where you need to make money quickly, I would just focus on and just draw this out on a piece of paper. In the book, I just talk about, there's a spectrum, right? If you imagine for any particular skill or industry or topic, there's a spectrum, and you lie somewhere in that spectrum in terms of your expertise. And anyone to the left of you can gain value from the information that you know about that particular topic. And the further along that you are, the more people that can benefit from that, and the higher delta, or the greater delta there is between you and people on that spectrum, which means like the depth of value, or the quantity of value that they can get from you as well. And so I would just start thinking about, what are things that I have spent 3+ years on, right? Because in most cases, if you spent 3+ years on, most people haven't spent 3+ years on that exact thing. What are things that I think about in the shower? What are things that I've worked on for years that I wish existed when I started? Just start asking yourself those kinds of questions. What can I do? What have I spent time on that I could package into something that would take someone 1/10 or less of the time to learn? And so just starting to ask yourself those questions will give you a signal into what value you have to give. And then once you identify that, then it really just becomes a matter of, okay, which kind of method or which tool actually can facilitate this value the best, right? So it's depending on what you can actually articulate, does this actually take better form in a course or a podcast or through a blog or through an ebook or whatever? And so you can start to just think about it from once you've actually identified what value you have to provide. I think the reason that people get lost is because sometimes they go the other direction and they're like, I'm going to create a podcast. And then they try to fill in the gaps of what they should be talking about. And it should be the other way around. Identifying what value you have to provide, and then figuring out what medium is best to actually provide that to people. And then if you're not sure and you do have the financial runway, I would say not to force it. I've written about this in the past. One of the things that's been, I think, really beneficial for me is that I've been creating for the last 2-3 years my own projects while working. And even though that's been more work for me, I haven't had to force anything. I haven't had to put something out there just because I need to make my next paycheck. And so I only create things once I actually feel that I can provide value to people and feel that I want to share this with the world. And I feel comfortable charging people for this because it's high enough quality where they will get value. And if you have that ability, I know not everyone does, that's the advice I would give, to just start building your audience over time and then charging once you've figured out where you can provide value. Now, if you don't have that flexibility, then I would go with the suggestion that I gave about just starting with breaking down what you know best and where you fit along that spectrum, and then selecting one of those and starting there.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Fantastic. I think we're getting down to the last one or two. So I'm going through to see who I've missed. Noah, I know you had just added one. So if you're able to unmute, the floor is yours.
Yeah, totally. Thank you, Steph, for doing this.
No problem.
So I write specifically about my industry, and I've been in it long enough to probably consider myself at least somewhat of a subject matter expert. Mm-hmm. But part of the problem is I grew up in a really big family, and I want everybody to get along all the time. And so it's hard for me to come up with opinions that are a little bit controversial or that feel controversial, because I don't want, the strongest opinions I have are why don't we all just get along? So how do I overcome myself and get out of my own way to start writing things that might get people to disagree with me?
I would just go back to what I said before, in that becoming an expert somewhere, you can be controversial just in knowing things that other people don't know. And it doesn't necessarily need to be framed in a way of here's this crazy dramatic thing that is going to make you illicit conflict, right? That's not what if you look at my articles, one of them, the one that has been the most controversial. I wouldn't say is controversial at all. It's this article about you don't need to quit your job to make, right? It's just an article that I was talking about some of the concepts in here that actually by having a job and creating things on the side, I have more flexibility to explore my creativity and all this stuff. And one of the things that was controversial for people is I said that basically I think like people have a lot more time than they think they do, and they can utilize it more effectively. But there's like a lot of parents out there who are like, you don't know what it's like to have kids, or you don't know XYZ, right? Or I don't have the time. And whether it's controversial or not, that article alongside my other articles were all just from a place of experience, not necessarily expertise in this case, but just experience of something that I had done that many people hadn't done. And so I would just start there, and it really doesn't need to be controversial. I think, in fact, like many articles are not controversial at all. I cite this article in my book. It's called like I Sell Onions on the Internet. And it's like one of the most highly upvoted articles on Hacker News of all time. That is not a controversial title at all. And so don't seek controversy, just seek what's best. And sometimes that'll take form in things that are a little more controversial, because again, the further along that like spectrum you are, the bigger delta there is between you and other people on that spectrum. And so that can cause controversy where people disagree with you, potentially because you're wrong, but also potentially because they don't have the same level of information as you, right? Or they don't have the same experience set as you. And to really like reinforce this, like to anyone on this call, don't seek controversy. That's actually what I would say is one of the like downfalls of our internet, is because people seek controversy just to like have an opinion because they want an opinion, because they want to elicit a response from other people. Don't do that. Just operate from a place of what you know best. And sometimes that'll end up in like certain controversial opinions, but don't seek like controversy just because you can.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And I think we are down to our last one. Josh Mitchell, would you like to do the honors and close us out here?
Sounds like a plan.
Awesome.
Hey, Steph. So I guess the biggest question I've had is surrounding motivation. I'm curious, what percentage of the time would you say that you have to like make yourself do something versus feeling the intrinsic, organic desire to do it and not having to like drag yourself along?
So I think, for just given my current setup, in that I have a full-time job and like I create stuff on the side that doesn't need to be like my lifeline, most of the time it's just because I want to. Now that's one of the reasons that I actually wrote that article where I'm saying you don't need to quit your job to make, because I think sometimes I don't know what your situation is, but in many cases when people go and they're like, I'm going to be a newsletter creator or a podcaster and that's my thing, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to go all in, they haven't spent enough time, A, figuring out what they actually love doing, like what they naturally gravitate towards, and B, the incentive structure is messed up where now you have to go do this thing in order to survive, and you just naturally don't have the same like flowing relationship with things when you're in that situation. So again, I don't know your situation, but for me, I actually do. Writing this book, I didn't need to write this book. I have a full-time job. I just like really wanted to say these things. And so I think it depends on that structure a lot. But I would also say, tied to the first point that I mentioned, spend enough time before you dive into something to like go explore what you actually are doing, right? And once you do that, then you can actually have more confidence that if you're going to really go, launch a newsletter or podcast or whatever you want to do, that's something that you naturally have gravitated towards over time. So it doesn't feel as forced. Because I know that there are certain things that you're going to have to do over time that you don't want to do. That really shouldn't be a majority of the time, I think. It can be, but I think you should try your best to assemble your priorities so that's not the case.
Fair enough. Thanks a bunch.
No problem.
Fantastic. First of all, Steph, thank you for making the time to do this. I have a literal mountain of notes here. Not quite as long as the book, but I think just approaching it. Secondly, we will send out the recording to everybody who registered. So we'll obviously send a link to Steph's book if you haven't already bought it. When the recording is live in a day or two, we will send that out as well. And thank you everyone for the amazing questions. Steph, where should people find you and follow you and read your stuff? What's the best place to find you?
I'm most active on Twitter, which handle is Steph Smith IO. My site is stephsmith.io, and my blog is blog.stephsmith.io. And then, yeah, if you want to read my book, then it's actually, I don't even know the link. You're going to send it, right? It's like gum.co/doing content right or something like that. But yeah.
Yep, we'll send out the link. And yeah, if you Google doing content right, Gumroad or Steph Smith, it should pop up. But thank you so much for making the time. And thank you everybody for joining and all the questions. I just learned a ton and can't wait for everyone to read this book because it's unbelievable. So
cool.
Thank you, Steph.
Yeah, and if people do read it and you have any questions, you can either DM me on Twitter or email me. And we're doing these live sessions and we've already finished 1 week, but there's still 5 more if you want to join in.
Amazing. Yeah, these are great too because they're very like interactive and like true like workshops. So definitely recommended to join some of those if you haven't already. Cool. Thank you, Steph. And thanks everybody else. We will email out recording and some notes shortly.